Greetings to those of you who are arriving as we prepare to have this fourth talk. As is usual, we'll give just a few moments for people to arrive and to find their way to this video, and then we will begin. I shall be back in just a moment to start. Good evening to all of you who are joining us for our fourth in this series of Lenten talks being hosted here via the diocese in order to provide people with a means to have some ongoing spiritual discussion and nourishment in this period when the coronavirus is hindering so much of our normal and day-to-day activity. So I'm going to continue to give a few minutes for people here to sign in before we start. It's nice to see people arriving on time. I have to say I'm surprised or startled at how widely these talks and the other materials that the diocese is providing during this period, how widely they're being adopted. Over 15,000 people have connected to watch these talks, to download the other information that the diocese is making available just over the last couple of weeks, and that's really quite extraordinary. But we're pleased to think that perhaps this means that some good is coming and people are finding them useful. While we give people a few moments to connect, I'll just remind everyone that the diocese, our diocese is the Diocese of Great Britain and Western Europe of the Church abroad. We are providing materials for each of the significant days here during Lent for people who are not able to get into church for the services, which is now, at this stage in the epidemic, is almost everyone. And we've already, I noticed that it's been published today, apparently a little early, but you can find on our website of our diocese already materials for Wednesday evening, which is the Wednesday in 5th week of Lent, dedicated to the reading of the Great Canon of St. Andrew, which we read in segments at the beginning of Lent. It's read in its entirety this Wednesday evening, together with the life of St. Mary of Egypt. And already, if you go to the website of our diocese, you will find all of those materials online in English, Russian, Church Slavonic, and French. So you'll find there the Triodion, which contains the full Great Canon. You'll find there the life of St. Mary, which we'll be reading, and various other texts. The texts of the saints of the day on Wednesday nights, as well as prayers in the times of an epidemic, and so on. All of these are available already on the site. You can find them now if you have a look. And very nicely presented. They found a way to make it look pleasant enough. So this will enable you to pray with the church, even though you can't physically be in one of the temples on Wednesday night. And I would just take a moment to say here that I know many of you are taking advantage of video streaming of divine services that are being produced by many parishes around the world. Some of our own parishes in our diocese are live streaming some of their divine services at this time, and there are many others in Russia, here in the UK, in America, throughout Europe, etc. This is a wonderful thing, and it can certainly be very useful to help preserve a sense of our connection between ourselves and the life, the liturgical life of the Church during this moment when we're separated from it. However, I just want to say one word of spiritual caution, and that is that you must be very careful not to become spiritual spectators during this period. I've spoken a lot over the preceding 3 talks, this is now our 4th, about the different ways that the devil will try to take advantage of moments like this. He's always trying to use the circumstances around us to throw us off the spiritual life. And if in this time when we're separated from our temples and from that liturgical life, if we become overly dependent on live-streamed services or so on, to the point where that replaces our prayer life, or that becomes the substance of our prayer life, then we fall into a trap of becoming spiritual spectators, and the devil gets his heel in the door where he really shouldn't. As I say, these live-streamed things can be very useful, especially for younger people. They can be a wonder for children. They're a wonderful way of still seeing the things that they associate with church. And indeed, for all of us, in moderation and approached correctly, these things can be very, very helpful, which is why we bless the parishes to do them. But just be cautious with this, as with anything, that you don't let it go to excess. Just because we are not able to travel into the Divine Liturgy, it does not give us the excuse, as it were, to become spiritual spectators. We still have to do the work of prayer, because it's that work, whether that work is brought to life by traveling into the temple and praying there during the liturgical rites, or whether that work is engaged through our prayer at home, with our families, in our prayer corners, in our icon corners. It's that work of prayer that actually makes it into something transformative for us. And as I have said before, and will repeat again, there is nothing about our present situation, facing this temptation of the modern day, of the present moment, there is nothing about it that means we cannot grow spiritually, and that requires us to fall off the track of spiritual discipline. So use gifts in good moderation so that they become tools to help, rather things that further hinder us. So that's my little caveat, and as usual, we're not going to talk about the situation outside. There's plenty of material available, far too much material available online and so on, than is really useful for us, so we're not going to duplicate that here. We are instead going to try to focus on another element of our spiritual work, our spiritual life, as we have been doing in each of these evening talks, so that we are engaging in useful Christian growth and making fruitful use of this quiet time and still time that God has provided us with. However, before we begin, just one more caveat about the internet and this moment in time. I have given counsel individually to my own spiritual children as they've talked to me, but I've also seen others, and indeed most recently His Grace Bishop Luke of Syracuse, of Holy Trinity in New York State, one of our bishops of our church abroad, has publicly stated that he instructs all of the monks and seminarians and staff at Holy Trinity Monastery, where His Grace is based, to spend no more than 15 minutes a day reading news relating to the coronavirus and so on. This is very similar to the counsel that I've been giving people who have asked me, and I take advantage of this venue here to encourage the same amongst all of you who are listening. Bearing in mind that 99% of what you read in the news, whether it's true or not, there's nothing that you can do about it, and there's nothing that it gives you that equips you for anything other than worry or fear or distraction. I myself, if my own example is useful at all, I check the news for 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes at the end of the day, simply to see if there's anything in government statements that pertains to the instructions I must give to my priests in the diocese. But apart from that, nothing else, no other news, no social media. It really doesn't do anything other than distract the heart at the very least, and worse than that, can actually build an excess of worry and fear and anxiety, which does nothing for our spiritual life. Well, it does something. It hinders it. It harms it. So if you're capable of exercising this kind of self-control, I highly encourage all people to create such a discipline for themselves. All right, our talk tonight, the theme that I've set for us this evening, is one actually that came as a request from several people who wrote to the administrators of our site after watching one or another of our talks last week, asking if we could speak about spiritual discernment. And so we'll talk tonight about how to quiet the mind and the practice of the discernment of thoughts as an ascetical discipline. And I want to say right at the outset that this is not going to be a theoretical spiritual talk about deep mystical things. I find that oftentimes when people ask about certain themes, discernment, theosis, etc., they are succumbing wittingly or unwittingly to this trap that I've mentioned in earlier discussions of wanting to kind of seek after these seemingly esoteric or ethereal things, or approaching things in a very academic, very bookish, very learned sense, neither of which really relates in any practical way to our spiritual life. What we need to talk about are the things we can actually do in order to grow spiritually. And discernment is a tool, is a practice of Christian living that is given by the Church in order to do precisely that, to enable a growth in actual lived Christian life. So if we're to talk about it, we need to approach it right from the outset, not as some esoteric, ethereal point of interest in Orthodox vocabulary. We need to be looking at it as a concrete resource, a concrete dimension of life that can be used to actually change how we live on a day-to-day basis and how we approach our Christian struggle and our Christian labors. And it's in that light that I want us to look at what is called in our vocabulary discernment, or the discernment of thoughts, or the discrimination of thoughts, and how this can be practiced in a useful and productive way for every person. This is a dimension of life that is often associated with monasteries and with monastics. And while there are certain things, many things, that are really uniquely the purview of monasticism, there are certain dimensions of monastic life that are not meant to be emulated outside of a monastery or duplicated outside of a monastery. There are certain things in a marriage that are not meant to be duplicated outside of a marriage. When God blesses different ways of life, he is blessing things to be different in one context than another. But while, as I say, there are many things that are uniquely monastic, the practice of discerning thoughts is not. It may be that the focused attention on this aspect of Christian life is treated much more thoroughly and regularly within monasticism, within a monastery, and the kind of relationship that monks and nuns have with their spiritual fathers and spiritual mothers in that monastic setting. But the actual practice of discerning one's thoughts is not specific to monasticism. It is specific to humanity and what a human person must do when trying to orientate his heart and his thoughts towards God. And indeed, discrimination of thoughts deals precisely there with the heart and with the head, which are, as we understand in our Christian perception of our human nature, are intrinsically interconnected. What happens in the mind has an effect on what happens in the heart, and vice versa. The condition of the heart, the state of the heart, has an effect on what goes on in our intellect. And everyone, however educated or uneducated, however progressed or novice in the spiritual life, is aware that we have a desire to focus our heart on godly things, on good things, to dwell on what is righteous and true and beneficial. as St. Paul says in his letter to the Galatians. And yet, when we try actually to focus our mind on anything, whether it be these good and virtuous, beautiful things that St. Paul admonishes us to dwell upon, or whether it be anything else on which we attempt to focus our interior attention, our mind, our heart, our thoughts, many experience at the very moment that they try to endeavor to do such a thing, to be focused in this way, many experience this extraordinary cacophony of noise that seems to permeate the head and the heart. One more recent spiritual writer and teacher, Father Seraphim of St. Herman's Monastery in Platina, used to call this the television set that is playing in the back of the mind. It's a benefit of having someone writing in our own generation, is that they can speak with reference to practicalities and idioms that we know from our own day-to-day life. That radio noise or the television that's playing in the background of the head, so that when we try to quiet our thoughts, try to focus our mind, we find this blitz of noise that's always alive there, and which seems to us to be impossible to control. We try to control it, we try to quiet down that cacophony within our minds, but we don't seem to have any success. We try different strategies, different approaches, but nothing seems to work. And indeed, the harder that we try to quiet the mind, the more frustrated we become, the more disillusioned, disheartened we become, discouraged. And this is so partially because in our attempts, if we are trying to make these attempts for a Christian purpose and from within the context of the Church's teaching, very often people will take for themselves in this endeavor tools that are known to the Church, blessed by the Church, in order to still and focus the mind. Different ascetical practices, different regimes of prayer or physical activities, prostrations or manual labor or practices of silence, things that are genuinely good and genuinely do form part of the arsenal of tools that is given to the Christian through the Church in order to help control and train the mind to dwell on God. And yet, even when we use these things that we see bearing fruit in the lives of the saints, in the lives of our fathers, even when we use them, the mind seems incapable of being quieted. The heart seems unable to be calm, to be still. And precisely because we are trying to do what is a godly thing, and we're trying to do it by means of tools that come from the saints and from the Church, this is where frustration and disillusionment can creep in very easily into this practice. Why? Why does this happen, and what can we do about it? Well, we have to understand that this problem that I've just described, this iskushenia, this spiritual temptation that we face, is caused by a very basic issue. And it's that we don't properly, rightly understand what is actually going on within the heart, within ourselves. We only sense that something isn't right in there. The mind is just wandering at 1,000 miles an hour, but we don't really know why. We don't know exactly what causes this. We don't know why sometimes the mind is more active and other times it isn't. Why the mind sometimes thinks about good things and other times races toward everything that's lewd and inappropriate. We don't understand the specifics of what's actually taking place. We just know that something is because we experience the effects, the symptoms of whatever is happening in here or in here. And that is to say, we experience the clouded mind, we experience the noise, we experience the attendant passions that are born out of this never-ending stream of thoughts and images within us. We experience all of that, and so we know something isn't right, and yet we don't really know what is giving cause to it, or how, or why. And thus, for that precise reason, we don't know how to apply the measures to combat it correctly. Not simply because we don't fully understand how each of these tools is to be used, whether the tool might be a specific practice of fasting, or a specific practice of prayer, or a specific attentiveness to our thoughts, or a specific, whatever the specific is, these tools. It's valid and fair to say that most of us might not understand fully what these tools are and how they are to be used, though sometimes people are slow to admit that. Well, of course I know what fasting is. Well, do we really? Or are we still needing to be taught how to apply fasting to our actual spiritual lives and so on? But more fundamental, more basic, even than this limited understanding that we have of the spiritual tools set before us to combat that thing going on inside, more fundamental is that we don't know what it is we're trying to combat. What is it exactly inside of us that we need to correct, and that these ascetical tools are there to help us change? What really is going on inside of me, and what precisely needs to happen in order to change it? I labor this point a little bit, this fact that people get frustrated by the fact that they're using the church's weapons for a spiritual foe and not making progress. And people get frustrated by this more than they might get frustrated if they weren't relying and trying to use the church's spiritual tools. If they weren't using them and they were failing, one might say, well, worldly things will fail us. But when we try to take up the tools of the saints and we fail, then we start to grow disheartened. Can it be that these tools are of no effect? Or can it be that my heart, my mind simply cannot be changed, cannot be cured? But I would parallel this, I would give a little analogy to building a dam. Let us say you have a great concrete slab. This concrete slab, if one understands how dams are built, and how it pieces together with other concrete slabs, what a dam is supposed to do, how it must be constructed, if one understands the river that one is looking at, and how the water flows through a certain passage and so on, if one understands all of these things correctly, then that concrete slab can be put in its place with other things and can very effectively dam up the river, as it's meant to do. However, if we don't understand those things, if we don't understand the river and the flow of water at this place, if we don't understand the dynamics of how a dam needs to be structured and built, then that same concrete slab, if we simply cast it into the middle of the river, willy-nilly, as they say, will we really be surprised that it doesn't dam up the river? No, of course we won't. It's not to say that it can't. It's not to say that it doesn't have the potential. It's not to say that I don't have the potential with that to accomplish what I wish. But until I know how and what and why and where, this tool, even though it is useful in theory, in practice does me very little good. And this can be paralleled, I think, quite nicely to people who, sensing that there's something amiss in the hearts, leap towards the examples of the saints, etc., without being instructed, without an obedient submission to the church's role as teacher to show us how to use these tools, and we just pick up every spiritual tool. Extra fasting sounds good to me. A long rule of prayer sounds very good to me. And I pick all of these tools, but without the wisdom to know how to use them. Or, as I mentioned before, to really understand what's happening, the river flowing through my heart. If I don't understand the dynamics of it, what good is a tool if I don't know what to apply the tool to? So we must be aware of these realities in front of us. Fasting and so on, these have the potential to change our lives, to completely transform the heart. But we must know what to do with them. And this is true of all ascetical disciplines, and it is certainly true of the one that we're discussing tonight, discernment. So let's talk about discernment concretely. Firstly, I want to repeat, for the sake of those who came a little late, a caveat that I made earlier, which is that if we are really going to look at discernment in a sense of something that can change my heart, then we have to strip away from it all of the sort of external fascination that it seems to hold for our modern generation, that is always seeking esoteric quick fixes to our spiritual conditions. Many people approach the ascetical life, the spiritual life, with a kind of Hollywood fantasy about what spiritual life will look like. Mystical visions, states of ecstasy, other worldly spiritual phenomena, and so on. And because this is a temptation of our present generation, it often manifests itself when people try to look at key themes in our Christian ascetical life. Theosis, or deification, or dispassion, or discernment, or contemplation. What I identified earlier as some of the key vocabulary in Christian spiritual life. We have to be very careful that when we approach these things, we don't approach them with that kind of baggage or expectation, because it prevents us from going anywhere with them. Spiritual discipline is not based on broad concepts or ethereal fantasies, but on means of concrete action. What specific things can be done that in the doing of them, centuries of experience have shown can actually lead to a development of our spiritual life. Discernment, then, when we strip away that kind of gloss, is a practical tool relating to the control of thoughts and the effect that they have on the heart. By control, I mean how the thoughts enter into the hearts, and then what effect they're permitted to have there. Discernment is the correct, careful, and discreet observation of things that come into the mind, and through the mind into the heart. And I want to read for you a quotation. I'll read a few from two writings, chiefly on watchfulness and holiness by St. Hesychios the priest, and another one on discernment by St. Diadochus of Photiki. These are connected or collected in a book that in general I don't encourage you to read, which is the Philokalia, and not, as many English speakers appallingly say, the Philokalia. The Philokalia, the love of the beautiful. I say don't encourage you to read, because this is precisely the kind of text people flee to pick tools out at random. This is a compendium of materials aimed chiefly at monastics, in order to be used under guidance in monasteries. That was the original reason the Philokalia was compiled. It's a collection of texts that date back to the very beginning of the patristic period, the beginning of the church. And of course, I'm not saying unilaterally that no one outside of a monastery should read it. Of course not. Though even in monasteries, not everyone is allowed to read this book. I'm saying that you must be very careful, because this is precisely a collection of tools. And it's very easy to just pluck one out and say, I'll do that, with, again, no real understanding of the condition of my heart, the conditions needed to exercise this properly, as opposed to in a damaging way, and so on. So, that caveat being said, I am going to read a few passages that I think can be helpful in a broader context. And the first is one by Saint Hesychios, whose name beautifully means the stillness, Hesychia. He writes this: watchfulness is a continual fixing and halting of thought at the entrance to the heart. In this way, predatory and murderous thoughts are marked down as they approach, and what they say and do is noted. And we can see in what specious and delusive form the demons are trying to deceive the intellect. If we are conscientious in this, we can gain much experience and knowledge of spiritual warfare. A wonderful opening quotation to talk about discernment. A continual fixing and halting of thought at the entrance to the heart. Indeed, discernment, when we exercise it, is a kind of practice of setting a gatekeeper, a watchkeeper, at that place where thoughts and external provocations that give rise to our thoughts, at the place where those thoughts have the potential to enter into us, into the heart. So the fathers often will distinguish between a thought, kind of like a physical thing, that by some provocation approaches us. It reaches the rational intellect where we must decide what to do with it. And if we permit it, it will then descend into the heart where it affects us fully. Though it's already in a sense affecting us when it's being examined by the intellect. Now, of course, all of that can happen instantaneously. And that is oftentimes precisely the problem in our spiritual life. Discernment is a practice of setting up a kind of gatekeeper to keep track of those thoughts as they approach the heart, as he says, and halts those, as St. Ezekiel wrote, that approach the heart, that are murderous, as he says, and harmful. He says just a little bit later in the same text, these types of watchfulness, my child, act like doorkeepers and bar the entry to evil thoughts. So whether we think doorkeeper or gatekeeper or watchman, the practice of discernment is a practice of becoming selective and becoming more than just selective, of regaining control or claiming control over what actually enters into the heart in terms of external provocations, whether these are things that enter completely from the outside, that is to say things we see or hear or are spoken to us, or whether they enter through the imagination. We still must exercise some discretion over which of these provocations we are going to allow deep within us to have an effect at the very core of our being. And it's not just catching sight of what comes towards us, but learning the precise nature of what these things are and what effects they have on the heart. So if you're one who likes scientific terms, the fathers use these, like good physicians, they specifically identify things. And these are what would be called the logoi, the principles, the nature of things. Logos is one of those lovely terms that is almost impossible to translate. And the one translation everyone uses, word, is certainly the least useful to really understand what the fathers mean in cases like this when they use it. Discernment not only involves actually watching what's coming into the mind and through the mind into the heart, but also gaining an understanding, a discrete understanding of what those things are, where they come from, what their effects will be in the heart if permitted to enter there, and therefore the ability to make proper decisions, godly decisions, about precisely what is permitted into the heart rather than what is rejected from it. Let me read you a passage from St. Diadochus of Photiki about this selection of the right from the wrong based on an understanding of what we actually see in the heart. He says this: the light of true knowledge is the power to discriminate without error between good and evil. Then the path of righteousness leads the intellect upwards towards the Sun of Righteousness and brings it to the boundless illumination of real spiritual knowledge, so it will grow henceforward, more and more confident in its quest for love. The power to discriminate without error between good and evil amongst the thoughts that are in the mind. So, when we're speaking of discernment, we're speaking of this twofold discipline of the nous, of our deliberative intellectual capacity. On the one hand, to actually become watchful, to see what's going on, rather than just experience the effects of what has happened, to become like a gatekeeper, attentive and watchful of what is passing through the mind and into the hearts. And at the same time, discrimination, discernment, involves a discrimination between, amongst those things that we see, those which are good and those which are evil. And this is based on a right knowledge of what we're witnessing. Again, if we can step back from this terminology for a moment, the concept here is simple. I'm fond of saying to people, Christianity is not complicated. Christianity is very simple. Simple is not the same thing as easy. There's very little that's easy about the Christian life. But a thing not being easy, it does not have to be because it's complex. Sometimes what makes things difficult for us is simply the will to follow simple instructions. And so when we take a step back from all of our discussion of logoi and so on, and just look, the concept of discernment is actually quite simple. Many things are thrown at the heart. Some of them come from outside of us. Words that are spoken, sights that we see, events that are happening in the world around us or directly to us individually. Some of the things that come barreling towards the hearts come from a kind of intermediate place, which is our imagination. It's not particularly external, and yet our imagination is fueled by external things. What we have seen, what we have heard, and then how we creatively play with that, using, or rather misusing, the creative potential of the human intellect. So that we create quasi-external realities. We create things to be afraid of that might not even exist, or dimensions of things that do exist that we can become afraid of or angry at, etc., etc., or love and enjoy. So all of these things from these different sources come barreling at the heart. And the heart, because we live our lives having no filter, allows everything inside. So there is no gatekeeper, if we can use that image of St. Ezekiel's, to bar all of this from flooding into the heart. And so the heart accepts everything, the good and the bad together, barely able to distinguish one from the other, and in fact becomes completely unaware of how these things are arriving, where they come from, and so on. All that we know is that we experience this confusion of heart, confusion of mind, and all of the attendant passions to which it gives rise. But we're not able to say what exactly is causing our sorrow. Think about your actual experience of whatever the temptation might be: loneliness, sorrow, anger, bitterness, etc. The vast majority of the time, there is no concrete provocation at the moment we're experiencing those things. Take anger, for example. Anger is usually, not always, but is usually initially given rise by something that someone does or doesn't do to us. We'll take the active for this example. Someone does something mean to me, and I get angry. There is a provocation and a response. But that's instantaneous. This thing happens, it's done. Yet the anger that I feel perpetuates itself in my heart, not because the provocation is being repeated. This person is not standing next to me every day of my life repeating the angry thing that he did. But I am allowing memories and thoughts and reconstructions of that to perpetuate in my mind, and they flow into my heart, and so I create all sorts of things going on within me that are not actually provoked any longer by what's happening. And think about your day-to-day life. Think about just today, when many people have been in much more solitude than perhaps they normally would. And imagine that you had angry thoughts, judgmental thoughts. Now, is the person you were angry at actually with you? Are they sitting next to you? Have they today done the thing that caused you to feel anger today? The chances are perhaps in some, yes, but for many, no. But how often have we thought in this way? Normally, we just say, I'm angry. I'm angry. I'm feeling upset today. I'm feeling down today. I'm feeling happy today. These things can be good as well as bad. But we simply experience the effects without really knowing what's giving rise to them. The sad reality is it's hard for people to move beyond this "I am upset" into finding out exactly why, what that means, and what we can do about it. It's hard precisely because the act of identifying what's really going on within our hearts, if it happens at all, and the vast majority of people never put any real effort into this, it satisfies them enough just to say, "I'm angry," or "I'm happy," without really analyzing it further, maybe just beyond saying, "Oh, he did a mean thing to me," or "she upset me, and that's why I'm angry," and never actually moving any more deeply than this to try and understand what is it that is having this precise effect on my heart at this precise moment. All of our analysis, if it happens after the fact, when I'm already angry, when I'm already discouraged, when I'm already bitter. So we are exercising, as it were, a kind of spiritual damage control. I'm angry, I'm bitter, I'm judgmental. How do I stop? How do I stop? But just the experience is already causing spiritual pain, causing suffering within us. It's better than nothing to exercise damage control. Of course, it's better to put out a fire once it starts burning than let it keep burning. But of course, the aim is to learn how to live so that the fire doesn't start in the first place. So how do we actually do that? How do we set up that gatekeeper of the thoughts, as St. Ezekiel calls it, so that it can start to discriminate and to guide the mind towards accepting what is good and rejecting what is bad? Let's look at a little guidance from the Fathers on these practical things. If you want to start to actually control the mind, to actually quiet it down, and start to prevent it from accepting bad things into the heart, and to understand what is good for it and what is bad for it, you have to start by focusing it. The ultimate goal, as some of the Fathers will say in the ascetical writings of the Church, the ultimate goal is to have thoughtless thoughtfulness, right? To have no thoughts, no creative industry going on in the mind, but simply the unmediated experience of God and the world, not mediated by thoughts, but directly engaged with and perceived. That might be the goal. That is to say, the highest form is thoughtlessness, pure stillness. I use thoughtlessness with caution because we don't mean mindlessness. We mean something very focused and direct. But you can't start at the end, right? This is a principle that we've already, just in a few talks together, have had occasion to repeat multiple times with reference to prayer, with reference to humility, with reference to forgiveness. You don't attain the top of the spiritual mountain by leaping up and hoping you'll just land there. You have to start at the base of the mountain and then take reasonable, measured steps that others have trod before you, that they know will work and will aid you, and allow these to lead you from one step to the next so that you can attain the spiritual heights. So you can't sit down and simply say to yourself, I will turn off the television in my mind. I will simply sit here in a dimly lit room with a candle burning in front of my icons, and I will shut off all the thoughts that invade my mind. I'm sure everyone here has tried that. And I'm equally sure that not one person here has been successful in that. Because, as we discussed last week, the mind and the heart are habituated to doing things in a certain way, to letting thoughts and imagination, etc., flow freely, which is why we get distracted so easily when we try to pray, and why when we try to have a quiet mind, suddenly it's alive with all sorts of things that we don't particularly want to be thinking about. So you can't fool yourself into thinking you can go from chaotic noise to absolute stillness. Instead, the intermediary step is to focus the mind on something concrete that can be used to guide it through that noise into something more direct. And this is precisely where we use a tool like the Jesus prayer, which we discussed a little bit last week. This very short prayer that we recite softly, quietly, sometimes interiorly, sometimes in a spoken way, but which doesn't require deliberative thought or analysis. It simply flows off the tongue over and over again and allows us to, by dwelling, by focusing on that phrase, and by what we're doing in speaking that prayer, allows us to direct the thoughts rather than eliminate them, which we're not ready to do. We don't have that power yet. We don't have that skill practiced enough. Instead, we focus the mind in a godly manner, and in so doing, we are directing it towards a godly goal that reveals the weaknesses of the intellect along the way. So let me explain what I mean by that with a few little quotations. One, again, from St. Hesychios. Firstly, this is one of my favorite analogies that he uses about using prayer to still the heart. Right? When you focus on the Jesus prayer, it allows your mind to, by that intensity of focus, to start repelling the normal frivolity of the mind, which dances around from one thing to the next without any control. St. Hesychios writes this: if you wish to engage in spiritual warfare, let that little animal, the spider, always be your example for stillness of heart. Otherwise, you will not be as still in your intellect as you should be. The spider hunts small flies, but you will continually slay the children of Babylon. If during your struggle you are as still in your soul as the spider, and in the course of this slaughter, you will be blessed by the Spirit. He's talking about slaughtering the passionate thoughts. But there's that beautiful image, and if you have a garden, and if you've ever looked at a spider in its web, the spider hunts precisely by being still. When he's moving around on his web, constructing it, everything's moving, it glitters in the sunlight, and of course every insect sees it and stays clear. Once he's constructed his web, the spider sits in perfect stillness. And in that stillness, the unaware insects fly into the trap, and the spider can pounce. In the same way, we must still the mind in order to be able to see what's going on. The other thing that St. Hesychios is talking about is the fact that if the spider is running about the web, doing things, jiggling it, if an insect does happen to fly into the web, how will the spider even notice? With all of the jiggling of the web that he's doing himself, how is he going to notice when a bug flies in? Whereas if he's perfectly still and not moving at all, then the tiniest vibration of a little wing or a little foot will come to his attention. And this is precisely what needs to happen within us. When we allow the mind to dance around without control, then we notice very little about what actually happens in it. Right? And many of you will have noticed this. One of you asked about it when we were talking about prayer, about the distraction that comes from thoughts. The thing that surprises people when they really start to look at the distractions that they face in prayer is how late they notice them. And perhaps you've noticed this in your own prayer. You don't notice your mind is wandering the instant that it wanders. You only notice after the fact that actually I've been thinking about my shopping list for the last 10 minutes, right? You don't notice that it's happening. And yet, when you suddenly become aware of it, you realize this isn't instantaneous. The last 10 minutes have been spent doing this other thing, focusing on this other thing. When so much is going on, it's hard to notice anything in particular. And that's a reality behind that experience that so many people have. And so by using something like the Jesus prayer, it allows us to focus the mind on one stable, godly reality. And as we do that, even though the mind is still far from really still, it's much more still than it normally is. And by this intermediary step, by slowing down that dance of the intellect, we start to become more and more aware of those distractions, like the little insects flying into the web that we didn't notice before. We start to actually see them more vividly and more clearly. And when we do, we then can more effectively and swiftly draw the mind back to attention from its wandering. This is something hinted at by St. Diadochos once again. Those pursuing the spiritual way, he writes, must always keep the mind free from agitation, in order that the intellect, as it discriminates among the thoughts that pass through the mind, may store in the treasures of its memory those thoughts which are good and have been sent by God, while casting out those which are evil and come from the devil. When the sea is calm, fishermen can scan its depths, and therefore hardly any creatures moving in the water escape their notice. But when the sea is disturbed by the winds, it hides beneath its turbid and agitated waves what it was happy to reveal when it was smiling and calm. And then the fisherman's skill and cunning prove all in vain. The same thing happens with the contemplative power of the intellect, especially when it is unjust anger that disturbs the depths of the soul. A beautiful passage. So where St. Ezekiel uses the spider and the web, St. Diadochos uses fishermen upon the sea, and how you can see through the waters when they're calm. When they're agitated by the winds, one can't see through them at all. We must keep the mind free from agitation so that the intellect can discriminate the thoughts that pass through it. And this is precisely where we get into that discrete act of watching what is happening in the mind. Again, we can't do it when all that we hear is this flurry of noise. But once we start to focus that through the use of the Jesus prayer, and we start to become much more consciously aware of these pinpricks of thoughts arriving in our mind, whether from outside or from within, once we start becoming aware of them, then we can start to look at them and to examine them and to see whence they come. Is this from God, as St. Diadochos says, or from the devil? What effect will they have? And ultimately make the decision whether to allow them into the heart or not. When we are praying the Jesus prayer, to take that out of theory into practice, think of it like this. When you're praying and your mind wanders and you find that you're distracted by a thought, take note of why. Right? What emotion or feeling did I feel that allowed me to follow this? Did this thought create bitterness and I followed the bitterness because I'm used to being bitter, or I find a certain comfort in being bitter? Was it lust and so I followed the lust? Was it gratification? Was it excitement? Again, thoughts can provoke us by positive emotions rather than negative. Both can be effective depending on our own spiritual state. But we have to look and say, what specifically, what emotion was created, what feeling was created in me that allowed my mind to be swayed in the direction of this particular thought? So rather than just saying, oh, I got distracted by thinking of shopping, well, why? What exactly about that thought attracted you so much that it pulled you away from prayer? Is it that you're worried about your family? Is it that you're concerned about your innate forgetfulness? Is it that you are hungry and your stomach is dictating which way your mind should go? There can be 1,000 different reasons why this thought led me away. What's the reason, or what are the reasons, that I was led astray, that I was led to focus that thought rather than stay with the prayer? And we can also look and say, well, what provoked it? It's a related question. Where did the thought come from? If it's an external provocation, then we need to see that. Now, most external provocations, when we're trying to sit quietly in prayer by ourselves, are going to be from demonic forces. The devil will push a thought at us, because usually there isn't some physical person in the room with us shouting at us at that moment. So the external forces will be demonic influences. Of course, the positive side is we also have the influences of the saints, of the angels of God himself, that can provoke good thoughts within us, as St. Diadochus said in the passage we just read. But provocation can also come from within. Is it a memory that caused that thought to emerge? If so, why that memory right now? Where did it come from? Did the memory, was it in turn provoked by hunger? Is it that I'm worn out and tired and that's why I'm remembering all of the things that have upset me from this morning, etc.? We can start to see the specific provocations for the thoughts. So you see, just by looking carefully, we can see what is the thought and where has it come from. And when we're engaging in our prayer, that's the degree to which we want to engage actively with it. I mentioned in our discussion on prayer last week that it's important not to become distracted by the analysis, distracted by discernment, because this is, again, it's a way that the devil tries to take a good thing like discernment of thoughts and discrimination of thoughts and use it itself to distract us. And if we start to hyper-analyze every single thing that goes on in the mind when we pray, we will distract ourselves by that action. No, once we have seen with what becomes a clearer and clearer vision, the more that we practice it, once we have seen what the thought is that has distracted me, where it's come from, what it's doing, then we can dismiss it and return to our act of prayer. So these little insights that we get from the Fathers start to reveal for us the eminently practical nature of discerning our thoughts. The way to control the mind is not some, if I can use it in a worldly sense, a mystical engagement with some calmness that pervades us. It comes through the discriminating understanding of what's happening, and therefore, through that understanding, the ability to choose what I will respond to and what I will not. Let me read a wonderful little passage from St. Ezekiel. I will now tell you, in plain, straightforward language, what I consider to be the types of watchfulness which gradually cleanse the intellect from impassioned thoughts. Gradually cleanse the intellect. The saints are very aware of what we too often want to forget, that this is a process that develops with practice and with steadfastness. In these times of spiritual warfare, I have no wish to conceal beneath words whatever in this treatise, whatever may be of use, especially to simple people. As St. Paul puts it, pay attention, my child Timothy, to what you read. So here we go. One type of watchfulness consists in closely scrutinizing every mental image or provocation. For only by means of a mental image can Satan fabricate an evil thought and insinuate this into the intellect in order to lead it astray. A second type of watchfulness consists in freeing the heart from all thoughts, keeping it profoundly silent and still, and praying. A third type consists in continually and humbly calling upon the Lord Jesus for help. A fourth type exists to always have the thought of death in one's mind. These types of watchfulness, my child, act like doorkeepers and bar the entry to evil thoughts. So he returns there to that image of the doorkeeper. So notice how he's spelled out these four different ways in which the doorkeeper keeps track of thoughts. By identifying clearly what they are and where they come from. By quieting the heart so that it experiences above all the presence of God, but also more attentively sees what is being thrown at it from the outside. By remembering Christ in prayer and thus focusing the mind into the heart, and by, he says in his fourth step, by always having the memory of death in one's mind. I won't go into that in great detail now. That is something that is definitely part of the monastic culture more than the non-monastic culture. But if we can boil it down to something very straightforward, the remembrance of death is an extrapolation on what St. David writes in the Psalms. Lord, teach me to number my days, that I may apply my heart to wisdom. Right? The awareness of the finitude of life is something that, rather than frightening us because it's all about to end, instead inspires us with wisdom because we want to use the life that we have to prepare us for the eternity of the life to come. As we practice these things in the manner that we've talked about, we start to become active surveyors of our thoughts and their provocations, rather than simply chasing after the effects that they have in our emotional states and the effects that they produce in our passionate lives. We start to actually survey them as they come at the heart, rather than simply via what they do to the heart once they're already there. And this is, as St. Hezekiah said or implied by speaking of the gradual illumination of the heart, this is a skill that must be developed and practiced. And the more attentive we are, the more we start to see. When you focus the mind and quiet it to the degree that you can, and then start to actually look at the thoughts, we start to see more and more. Right? The same, I remember being in university as an undergraduate, and I had a professor. It was not an art class, but I had a theology professor who happened to love art very much. And I remember observing in myself, never having had any at that point in my life training in visual arts, painting, etc. I remember watching in myself the progression that happened because of his influence. He would put paintings up, and at first my response was, well, that's a pretty painting, it looks nice. But as he would educate me as to what made it beautiful, what were the things that go into a painting, what are its ingredients, its elements, proportions, and all of these things. And as I observed more and more paintings and became more and more aware, I started to see much, much more. So that by the end of a course, he would put a painting up, and rather than saying, oh, that's just a pretty painting, though I still had that effect of saying it's beautiful, I could now see so much more in it. I could see the artistry of brushstrokes, the wisdom of the way certain pigments might be mixed, the effect of proportion and space and the composition. All of that which was there before, but which I didn't see. The ability to see it came with the practice of doing. And it's the same with our own hearts. When you first start to watch your thoughts, you'll see only very basic things. That's bad, that's not so bad. That might even be good. But the more we watch the thoughts, without becoming obsessed with them, but watching them and then letting them go and focusing again on the prayer of Christ, the more that we do this, the more we start to see of what really is happening. We can start to see not only I'm angry, but why, and why this emotion has come at this precise moment, and what it will do to my heart if I allow that thought in. The more attentive we are, the more we see. There's a passage on that as well here. Attentiveness, this is once more from St. Hezekiah. Attentiveness is the heart's stillness, unbroken by any thought. In this stillness the heart breathes and invokes, endlessly and without ceasing, only Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God and himself God. Through this invocation, enfolded continually in Christ, who divines all hearts, the soul does everything it can to keep its sweetness and its inner struggle hidden from men, so that the devil, coming surreptitiously upon it, does not lead it into evil and destroy this precious work. The more we practice, the more we see what leads us away from that sweetness. And then we are able to halt them a little earlier. I mentioned early on, and I'll move towards concluding with this thought. I mentioned early on that the fact is we see all of these things, the effects that our thoughts have, only after the fact, right? It's only once I realize I'm angry that I then look back and say, well, what made me angry? But by then I'm already angry. The more that we watch the heart and become aware of what thoughts enter in that stirs up that anger, the more diligently we practice that sense of observation, of discerning, watchfulness, we start to develop the skill of seeing those thoughts as they're entering rather than after they've entered. And this is what we're working towards in our spiritual life, is to watch the mind and to see these thoughts as they form before we've given life to them and before we've accepted them into the heart. and saying, I know you. You come at me from time to time, and I see you. I've become familiar with your shape and with your voice and with your walk. And I see what you're coming, and I know what you'll do if I let you into my heart. And so we begin to see these provocations sooner and sooner in that process of traveling into the heart. And the skill that we strive to develop is to cut them off before they can make that journey. To become so conscious of and discreetly aware of the thoughts and the passions that provoke us, that we can see them on the horizon and cut them off, shut the door. That's the doorkeeper's job. It's not just to let in the good, but actively to shut the door against the bad. And this is what we wish to do as we advance in the spiritual life, is cut off those provocations before they're allowed to trouble the heart. But again, we will only reach that point if through diligent and steadfast labor we work to understand what is happening. The more we do this, the more familiar the thoughts become, the more familiar their true shape becomes. And in spiritual battle, just as in practical battle on a physical battlefield, knowing your enemy is half of the victory. If you've never engaged with any kind of practice that makes you aware of your enemy on the battlefield, and you suddenly see a great army approaching towards you, your response will be chaotic and fruitless. But good soldiers spend their lives training to know exactly, it's not just an army coming at me, but there are tanks, there are planes, there are foot soldiers, and I know what tanks will do, and I see the ground, so I know where they will go, and I know where foot soldiers will go and what they will do, and so I can apply the defenses. Knowledge is half of the victory. And the same is true with our thoughts. When all we see is a rush of thoughts at the heart, we can only at best give a haphazard attempt at stopping them. But we will be largely fruitless in that effort. But if we can, through this watchfulness, become discerning, not just saying thoughts are overwhelming me, but this thought, and I know this thought, I know how it behaves, I know how it will sneak through my other passions and weaknesses, and I know exactly what it will do in the heart because I've let it in before and I've seen the effects and I've learned from that. Now when I see him approaching, I can say, no, I will block the way into the heart so that you don't have that effect on me again. This is what we're doing when we watch the mind, when we watch the heart. And this is something that transforms the heart deeply and powerfully, because the heart becomes habituated to return to this frequent spiritual concept, becomes habituated towards watchfulness rather than the lack thereof, laziness. And the heart that is habituated to watchfulness will keep its eyes open and will not be ruled by external things. So I want to read one last quotation from St. Ezekiel, and then I'll give you the opportunity to ask questions. You can start to pose your questions now if you wish. They take a moment to appear. But one last quotation from St. Ezekiel the priest. Be watchful as you travel each day the narrow but joyous and exhilarating road of the mind, keeping your attention humbly in your heart, reproaching yourself, ready to rebut your enemies, thinking of your death, and invoking Jesus Christ. You will then attain a vision of the Holy of Holies and be illumined by Christ with deep mysteries. Be watchful. I'll just repeat that opening line because I find it so beautiful. Be watchful as you travel each day the narrow but joyful and exhilarating road of the mind. There is nothing to fear in the mind. The intellect, the thoughts, when properly orientated, are aspects of this creation that God means to be beautiful and joyous. And we traverse this every day, knowingly or unknowingly, attentively or inattentively. But if we are attentive, we can make of that journey through the mind, as St. Ezekiel calls it, which leads into the heart, something that is strewn not with the stones of the things that hinder us, but clear and prepared as a pathway on which we can walk towards a pure heart and the continual remembrance of our living God. So on that note, I will finish with my talk as in terms of prepared things to say. And as usual, we have some time now for a few questions. And I see one or two have come in. You're free to type them into the side, and I'll get to a few in the time that we have. Paula asks this: how can we address the problem when we are only too happy to acknowledge that we are not ourselves monastic, or to acknowledge our weakness in terms of observing even the smallest acts of asceticism, and the opposite extreme of being overzealous for the spiritual esoteric? Maybe we're sometimes too glad for our lowliness, and so become complacent and fall away. That's a lovely question, Paula, and it's a wise question, because these are two extremes that people do tend to oscillate between, and there is a tendency to be sort of inclined towards one or the other. Some people try to take on far too much without knowing what they're doing, and that's a perpetual temptation. Others say, well, I just can't really do anything, so I'll just make the sign of the cross, and that's all I can do. Most of us bounce between these over the course of our spiritual lives. The fact of the matter is, every Christian person is created to experience the full glory of communion with God. Everyone. There is no one so lowly that they cannot see God face to face and hear his voice. When we are feeling that way, because we have grown discouraged by our own failings, we have to then remind ourselves of that. This is a basic fact of our life. God created us for glory, not for baseness, not to live a shadow of life, but the fullness of life. And we have to recognize that the discouragement we feel is not because we are of a lower class, incapable of attaining these things, but because we have fallen down and we need to get up and keep walking. And similarly, if we're succumbing to the opposite temptation, which is to think too highly of ourselves and our spiritual abilities, well, usually our own failings will bring us back. But if not, we must continually set our spiritual life before the gaze of the Church, our spiritual Father. I mentioned this last week with respect to prayer, lest we fall into delusion. Right? And the surest sign that you are not making spiritual progress is a confident belief that you're certain you are. Right? There's nothing wrong with recognizing progress when God allows you to make it and helps you to make it, so long as that's not transformed into a kind of pride and self-assurance. And the safest measure there is to lay everything before your priest and before the Church, in order that what I'm doing within is scrutinized by someone other than myself. St. Ezekiel, in another place in the text I was reading, talks about every person's innate inability to correctly judge the labors of their own heart. We require another to look at us and to guide us and help us in this way. All of us stand in the middle. We're not that lowly and we're not that high on the spiritual ladder. We're all in the middle, and we must work to take a step forward from wherever we are. It doesn't really matter if we're here or if we're here. The question is, do we take the step in this direction or the step in this direction, right? Because this direction leads to death, and it leads to death whether you're up here or whether you're down here. If you step down, you're going down, right? Similarly, a step up leads to life, whether you're already here or whether you're still here. St. John of the Ladder, when we commemorate him, we put the ladder to paradise as our main icon. And it's important, one of the great spiritual messages being conveyed by that icon is that there are demons attacking and saints falling off the ladder at every level, right? So there are, in most depictions of that icon, there are saints at the very top step of the ladder falling off, being dragged down by the demons. Right? So there's no point where we cannot fall, and there's no point where we cannot grow. It's a question of applying ourselves, not becoming arrogant when we have a success and not becoming despondent when we have a failure. Uh, Michaela asks, how can we understand whether the thoughts that we're encountering are ours or from evil? And when shall we confess them? Well, part of that, as St. Ezekiel said in one of the quotations that I read to you, part of that comes from familiarity. Right? At the beginning, when you start to watch our thoughts, when you start to watch your thoughts, it's almost impossible to distinguish whether a provocation towards a thought is coming from my imagination or from a demonic influence. But the more that we scrutinize and bring these things up, you mentioned confession. Confession is an integral part of developing our watchfulness, because everyone starts at the beginning in this process, and when we are beginners, we do not always make the right determinations. Is this good? Is this bad? Is this demonic? Is this not? And so we must go and lay this before our confessor, who, again, in part through his wisdom and experience, but much more so, more significantly so, through the grace of his ordination, that it is the Holy Spirit that enables him to actually say to you, no, that's actually not what that thought meant. That's not the response you should have had. As we accept that guidance that comes through confession, that comes through spiritual reading, and so on, and exercise this watchfulness, we start to be able to see, so that's what a demonic provocation looks like within me. And that's how to differentiate it from the work of my own creative imagination. It's worth pointing out that the creative imagination can be just as, if not more damaging to our spiritual life than demonic provocation. And we've mentioned in another talk that one of the devil's great joys is when we take over his job for him. So it's not as if we have sort of temptations of our own imagining and then these far greater demonic temptation. I would actually say it's the inverse in most cases. Most of the time, the demonic temptations are the easier ones for us to overcome. It's the ones that we create ourselves that are much more firmly rooted in our experience, in our passions, and therefore can be much more difficult to overcome than the rock that the devil throws at us. Sometimes we open ourselves to demonic influence much more dramatically, but as a general rule, this seems to be the case for most people. So by submitting to that observation and through obedience to the correction and guidance of the Church that comes to us through confession and these other means, and by continually watching our thoughts, we start to see which come from which source. This, by the way, is why dreams come up so often when it comes into questions of spiritual life. People are very eager to put a lot of trust in dreams. And of course, it is possible, we know it happens, that God, the angels, the saints, can communicate to people in dreams. We do know that it is not their preferred means of doing so. God can speak quite effectively without having to go through a dream. So can the angels, so can the saints. At times this method is used, but it seems to be extremely infrequent if you look at the course of spiritual history and of Christian history. And yet today people want every dream that they have to have some deep spiritual significance. And this creates a real spiritual trap, because so often people are trying to extrapolate meaning from dreams without yet possessing the watchfulness and the discernment to understand if the dream, the visions of that dream, are simply imagined. The mind produces dreams, and it can produce lots of visions within dreams, or whether these are angelic visitations, godly visitations, or demonic visitations. Most people have not developed that discernment, and so the faith, the stock put in dreams, becomes exceedingly dangerous. And people will say, oh, but it was a vision of the Mother of God. Well, the demons have been appearing to monks under the guise of the Mother of God for centuries, under the guise of God himself for centuries, of the angels and archangels. What makes you think that just because you saw something that felt holy or looked holy means that it was holy? Even the devil can appear as an angel of light. So we don't put stock in things without the discernment to judge precisely where they come from. Sarah asks a question: how do we deal with the constant pressure of work, where we're having always to concentrate on what we're doing and cannot then be aware of our inner thoughts? I already had the idea to be disciplined enough to put time at the beginning and end of work to be still, but this is hard, etc. Yes, there is work that requires dedicated focus. I mean, if you're piloting an airplane filled with passengers, I think we all want the pilot to be focused quite diligently and quite directly on all of the dials and instruments and things that are required to fly the plane. We don't want him trying to turn inward into his heart and analyze every thought and memory and so on at that moment. And indeed, this is true for all of us in our spiritual life. The active work of watching the thoughts is something that requires discipline and time and focus. But here's where this relates to your situation. You asked about work, Sarah, etc. The active work that we put in when we do set aside time, right? And though, yes, one has to go to work, there are times when one isn't at work, and we have the choices to make as to what we'll do with that time. When we do set aside parts of our lives to diligently practice these spiritual aspects of Christian life, it changes the heart and the mind in ways that will have an effect even beyond those set times, right? So if you spend time diligently watching your thoughts when you can pray quietly and so on, your heart and your intellect together will start, again, gradually, not all at once. It's not a magic switch, but gradually they will start to become comfortable being aware of things without that intensity of focus being required. That focus is necessary because we're trying to develop a skill. Think of it the way a sportsman might do exercises and bodybuilding, right? It requires the sportsman or the sportswoman to go to the gym and to lift weights, right? One has to set aside a few hours each week to go and do this physical work of developing the muscle mass and all of those things that go with it. However, by doing that, you are strengthening muscles that are then going to be stronger even when you're not in the gym. When you're picking up around the house, you can suddenly lift heavier pieces of furniture than you could before. When you're working out on the farm, you can push pieces of machinery more than you could before, because what you're doing in the gym has an effect elsewhere. And the same is true with these spiritual works. When we apply our hearts to learning how to be watchful, and to becoming accustomed to watchfulness over the thoughts, that will be practiced by the heart even when we're doing other things, so that the heart and the intellect will be on watch even when we are focused on the tasks in front of us. But don't expect it to come all at once. We work for this. We've spent a lifetime, most people, becoming habituated to not doing this. So it will take some time to rehabituate and become accustomed to doing other things. Patrick asks, we are currently in a time when many are turning to virtual confession via phone or email for various reasons, be it distance from a close spiritual father, our current epidemic, or other things. What thoughts do you have on discerning the proper place of this practice there? Well, Patrick, it's a good question. Maybe we can conclude with kind of bringing this back into the circumstances of the present moment. Apart from situations like we are facing now, which prevent the normal practice of confession for many people, that is to say, going into the temple, standing with the heel over your head and the priest next to you and making your confession in this way. Where that is difficult at the moment. It's not impossible, but very difficult. Barring such challenges, I would say, and I always do say, do not engage in remote Christian life. confession is meant to be done exactly that way. There's a reason that throughout centuries of life, the church has done this and continues to do this. And people have, throughout the course of history, had to travel on foot for miles and days in order to go and make a confession. And they did it because they knew that it was important to go through that experience. So, barring situations where, for a temporary period, it's made almost impossible for us, in which case, as an act of economia, the church may say, all right, well, telephone the priest and talk to him this way, etc. Barring that, this is not an advisable solution. And I have noticed, to my unhappiness, the propensity in our modern world, because the internet and telephones and mobile phones and all of that make communication so much easier, that people are kind of naturally defaulting towards this. And absolutely not. The only circumstances that I personally, with my own spiritual children, ever hear confessions over the telephone are if it's of a priest who cannot confess to someone else because there's nobody else around. He's the only priest in his region. I'll allow him to do so from time to time by telephone. Or if it's the child of a priest with no other priests around, because it's not ideal for the child of a priest to confess to his or her own father. It can hinder the sense of freedom and openness, and one might be embarrassed to talk about the feelings that I have about my own father if he's the priest I'm confessing to, and so on. So it's rather customary that priests' children do not confess to their own parent. And in such a situation, if they live in a place where there are no other priests around, there I might allow them to call and speak by telephone. But barring those situations, never except by extraordinary economia. And this is because there is a living connection between us that cannot be reproduced by any other means. Even this wonderful opportunity that we have to be together via these live streams during Lent, it's not the same thing as sitting together face to face in a room, our lives connected, our breath connected, our hearts open to each other. And with the touch of the priest, as the Holy Spirit imparts the absolution of sins, these things are essential for us. And some people say, well, my spiritual father lives in Greece and I live here in Philadelphia or here in Manchester, wherever it is. I say, you can receive spiritual counsel from anyone, anywhere, as long as it's done properly within the church. But in terms of actually shaping your Christian day-to-day life, your spiritual father is your priest in your parish. Right? This phenomenon of saying, well, my spiritual father lives 1,000 miles away and I see him once a year or twice a year. I'm sorry, but that is not the way spiritual fatherhood works in terms of concrete guidance over our work in the heart. It's never worked like that, and it never can work like that, because our lives cannot be connected in the same way. Now, can I have a spiritual teacher who lives on the other side of the world, who prays for me, to whom I turn in times of need, etc.? Of course, of course. But there's a phenomenon in our modern jet-setting age to fly to Optina and find an elder and say, my spiritual father is in Optina, my spiritual father is in the Lavra in Kiev, my spiritual father is on Mount Athos. Well, unless you are on Mount Athos, then you cannot have the kind of day-to-day relationship with someone helping you through your day-to-day life that someone can living there with that confessor. But you can have that, and you do have that with your priest. And people will often say, I don't have the same connection with my priest. That's not what's important. We are a guruistic generation. We want to find just the right guru for me. Right? Again, we would never use such brash words, but that's what we're doing. We have to find just the right teacher who interacts with me in just the right way. But that is a temptation that will keep us from ever really making spiritual progress. God has given you a priest, and God has given that priest the grace of his own Spirit in order that he can guide and help you. So when we have temporary situations as we do now, okay, we always find ways to make do. But the moment that that situation is lifted, we will return immediately to all of our normal practices. Don't become habituated to what is lesser. Use it as a God-given help to see us through a time of trial, and immediately return to what is greater the moment that God restores that blessing to us. And I want to end then on that note. Now that we've finished our talk, let me say one thing about the situation with the coronavirus and the fact that so many people are not able to go to church. And I want to say this generally and then specifically. Generally, don't be afraid by our current situation. And here I'm not talking about the virus itself. A Christian should not have fear of that. I'm talking about the church situation. It's very understandable and in many ways praiseworthy that Orthodox people naturally become upset when they are told you cannot go to the liturgy on Sunday. Of course it upsets us. For many people, this is the first time in a lifetime that they're not in church on a Sunday, for example, or this Wednesday evening might not be in a temple when we read the full Great Canon and the Life of St. Mary, etc. And of course, this makes us sad. Of course, this makes us upset. But, please remember, everyone, and tell your children, and tell your family, and tell others as you speak to them and communicate with them in this time. Don't be afraid of that either. There have been many periods in the course of history where, for whatever reason, be it a plague, be it a war, be it a political upheaval, where for a moment it was not possible for all of the faithful to go to the temples. God always sees us through. Don't believe that because you cannot be in the temple, you cannot pray, or that your prayer is lesser or ineffectual. The priests are praying in the temple, and in doing so, they are fulfilling a mandate that has existed amongst the priesthood for thousands and thousands of years, back into the times of the Old Testament, where the priests were called apart to offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. We strive to live in a world where the people can be present and stand under the same roof as the priest when this is done. And most of the time, that's possible. But there have been many moments in the course of Christian history where this has been interrupted by circumstances. The priests will fulfill their calling before God and will lift up the prayers offered for you and for the whole world on your behalf, and it will be effectual and received openly by God, whether or not you are in the temple. And similarly, God will hear your prayer offered piously and humbly with your family, with your children, standing before your icons on those days when it is not possible for you to be in the temple. And the mysteries will be made available to you. We have seen all throughout our diocese, all throughout our 11 countries in this diocese, we have seen, despite our diocese containing at this point nations under the strictest lockdown anywhere in the world in response to this virus, we have not seen one country where it has been made impossible for our priests to bring the holy mysteries to those who need them. Not one, despite the fact that in other ways we are completely locked down. God will never, never deprive us of these things if we piously wait upon him. But if we wail and tear out our hair because for a month or whatever this period might be, we're not able to go to the temple the way that we have become accustomed and should be accustomed to doing, then what do we think the devil will do? He will take that as an opportunity to sow doubt and to sow distraction and to make our prayer weak and ineffectual. Don't give him the opportunity. I implore you with all of my heart, be at peace. Don't be afraid. Don't feel that God has abandoned you or that your spiritual life will suffer irreparably. God is giving you a time, a moment to grow spiritually. And if it means for a short time to be separated physically from the temple, may it be as God ordains. Wednesday evening we'll read the life of Saint Mary, who for years and years and years lived apart from the temple and apart from the holy mysteries. And yet God created of her, in her patience and in her endurance, one of the most remarkable examples of holiness this unworthy world has ever seen. So if he will do that for her, do you not believe that he will do it for this generation too? And we can say this generation is wicked and debased. That is very true. But let the life of St. Mary, as we read it again this week, let it be a reminder. Her life was wicked and sinful and debased, even beyond, by her own admission, most of what we will ever experience in terms of debasement. And yet God made of her an extraordinary saint. God will do the same with you if you will not lose heart, if you will not be distracted by our present trials, but instead retain your calm, your faith, your love, and your piety. Watch over your hearts, and God will be with you and will bless you. Finally, before we go, we must change the times for this week because we will have the canon on Wednesday evening. Our next talk, please take note of this and I'll ensure that they correct it on the website announcements and so on. Our next talk will not be on Wednesday, but will be on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. So we will have tonight's talk, Wednesday evening, the Great Canon and Life of St. Mary. On Thursday evening, another Lenten talk. On Friday evening, the Akafist hymn, and all sorts of materials available for you. God bless you. Have a peaceful, a prayerful, and a holy night. Amen.